Welcome back to the class. And today is the final class for the week in which we look into the influence of feminism on Indian sociology. We look at how, under various names like women's studies or feminist studies, how feminism has been able to make a huge influence and impact on the way in which sociologies understood and practiced in India. So we had a discussion about Sharmila Rege on her work on Sharmila Rege. We also had a discussion on Sujata Patel's essay yesterday. We also had a discussion about Aparna Rai Prol's essay on feminist methodology and other aspects. And today I'm introducing you an edited work titled Reimagining Sociology in India, Feminist Perspectives, edited by Gita Chadha and M.T. Joseph. And this work contains very interesting set of readings about various dimensions of this intersection between feminism and sociology in India. So I thought it's maybe pertinent to discuss the introductory chapter written by the editors Gita Chadha and M.T. Joseph, because it gives a kind of a very larger, a kind of a holistic view about the contents of the book, and also it engages with a series of substantive issues that confronted Indian sociology regarding the gender question. So this is a book published in 2018, published by Routledge Publication, 2018, and it is dedicated to two important scholars. One is Kamala Ganesh and Sharmila Rege. Kamala Ganesh was a faculty of Bombay University, and both the editors, they belong to Bombay University. And Sharmila Rege, as you know, she was a professor in Pune, and then she became one of the very important voices of the feminist perspectives within Indian sociology. So just have a quick look at the content. There's an introduction by Gita Chadha and M.T. Joseph. We are going to look at this particular chapter, introduction, mapping and marking feminist sociology in India. Then, and also there's an interesting section of the part 1, reading and writing early women in sociology. This is a very important one because it looks at, or it actually chronicles the important sociologists, important women sociologists in the early in the formative years of the discipline. And it's very important because many of these women sociologists do not find themselves a place in the current sociological understanding, or they are kind of no longer included or recognized or debated or discussed in comparison with a number of other people. So there is an essay by Kushal Deb on Ratna Naidu, and there is an essay by R. Indira about Parvatama. And I was mentioning that she's the first, Dalit professor, sociology professor. She went to UK and then got trained under Professor Gluckman, and then she became a very, very influential scholar. But hardly she is, discussed or debated today. And there is an essay by Veena Punacha on Neera Desai, and Kamala Ganesh has written an essay on early women sociologists in India. So these sections are important, and we don't have the time to go through each of these sections, but I am just inviting you to read these essays. Then there are sections on pedagogies and mentoring, living processes. Then there is a third section on substantive transformation, erasures, intersections and insertions. And they're all written by both senior scholars as well as relatively young scholars and emerging scholars. There is a chapter on gender, mental illness and everyday life. There's a chapter on narratives in feminist sociology of science, contextualizing experience of women scientists in India by Rennie Thomas. So it's a very interesting volume, and anybody who is interested to understand the the trajectory of feminism and sociology in India, this becomes an important work. So let's get started with the introduction, and I will not go too detailed into that because typical of any of these edited volumes, this introduction as well deals with a number of general themes, and then it moves to the specific contributions. It comments, or it summarizes, and it comments on the specific contributions of each of these scholars who have contributed their articles. So I may not go too detail into that. So the essays in this volume engage with the historical, methodological, theoretical, pedagogical and substantive aspects of the intersection of feminisms and sociologies. And here you can see that the editors have used the term the plural terms feminisms and sociologies, basically to argue out that there are multiple voices, there are multiple strands of theorizations within these two divisions. They no longer represent the kind of a singular or homogeneous or a single voice. Rather, there are multiple voices. And now this volume lies in the seminar organized on genders, feminisms and sociologies towards the state of alteredness in 2014. And the scholars say that what really prompted them to organize such a conference in Bombay University. And again, you know that we have discussed it earlier. Bombay University is the first university in which sociology as a discipline was established, and it has a very, very rich legacy. Some of the most important people, including Patty Geddes and then A.R. Desai and G.S. Gurye, were associated with Bombay University. So that Bombay school or Bombay tradition is something very, very important, something that we say similar to that of a Lucknow school or Lucknow tradition. Bombay school has been something important, has been very, very important and influential from 1920s onwards. So it's almost 100 years of legacy that Bombay University has in terms of teaching and doing research in the field of sociology. So, it's all about how they conducted the seminar, especially after getting realized that the kind of a very, very small proportion of women sociologists in the department, in particular, and in sociology fields in general. So so they're taking the Department of Sociology at the University of Mumbai, hereafter referred to as MU, as a case in point. It also becomes evident that apart from numbers, the marginalization and erasure of women sociologists in the discipline is an important concern. So this is something that we came across yesterday, that from the very beginning, the social, which is the subject matter of sociology, has been seen as the world of the man. And it was a science. It was the mainstream sociology was a male stream sociology, as has been put in by people. So important sociologists looked at the society, the social, without the kind of a lens of gender, and which actually provided them a kind of a picture where the women's roles and women were more or less absent from their contributions. Yeah. No, there is a reference about earlier, writing of Kamala Ganesh, who was a faculty at Bombay University, and her take on family and kinship studies and other things. So I'm not getting into that because it's all about her previous work. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a quote by Kamala Ganesh. Despite radical political and epistemic potentials, social sciences and humanities in Indian universities were not gender sensitive. In my own department, research on women was not much forward in the 1970s. There was a question mark about the seriousness and rigor. An unspoken assumption hovered in the air that women universities like SNDT were academically a notch lower than Bombay University. It talks about the kind of a pervasive sense of inferiority that was attached to that. Now, more generally, we recognize that the small number of women, the systematic marginalization and erasure of their work in and through the making of male legacies, and the general disabling experience of women sociologists were not features unique to the Mumbai department but were prevalent across the country. We reckon that this scenario could be the internal reason for the feminist sociology not taking root in Indian sociology. So, as I mentioned yesterday in the previous class, sociology is one of the most reflective discipline. Okay, reflective discipline in the sense its practitioners, the people who practice sociology, they systematically reflect over their involvement in the discipline and the trajectory of the discipline over a period in time. So they will be able to see how skewed the discipline is being represented, what are the areas in which the discipline has been overrepresented, what are the areas, themes, and the people who are kind of neglected and relegated to oblivion. So as a result, there has been quite a lot of interesting discussions and debates about the way in which sociology as a discipline has been practiced, and there are so many books and volumes have been written, edited by by a host of scholars, including Veena Das, including Sujata Patel, Maitreyi Chowdhury, and Nandita Sundar. A host of scholars have written volumes about Satish Deshpande, volumes about how sociology has been practiced in the country, and what is the sociology of sociology in India. Okay, so in such discussions, of course, quite a lot of them are quite critical, talking about how certain perspectives have been sidelined, or how certain perspectives have been given undue importance. Okay, why certain perspectives and orientations are uncritically accepted, while certain other things are either directly or directly or indirectly kind of stifled. So, or there are arguments about this disparity between the way sociology is practiced in metropolis and then sociology is practiced in the peripheries. So these debates are very, very vibrant in the sociological tradition. So this marginalization of women in sociology is nothing new, or it is nothing peculiar to a particular university. So building upon the work of Sharmila Rege that aimed to develop a conversation between sociology and feminism, the seminar sought to foreground concerns of a feminist sociology in India, mapping the methodological, theoretical, and substantive intersections between the two. Rege, who forsook a career in sociology to build a women's studies department at Pune University, tragically passed away in 2013, and this was her premature death was seen as a great loss to Indian sociology, because she was a very, very incisive scholar who wrote extensively, and who actually wrote about very important themes like standpoint theory and Dalit women's questions, and one of her essays on standpoint theory and Dalit women we will be taking up shortly. Yeah. So they talk about why this book has been dedicated to these two people. Usually that is not done. Rege and Desai. Kamala Ganesh. Yeah. So now coming to this particular volume, the main objectives, they say, is to delve into the archive of memories and records to map and mark the trajectories of early women sociologists and read them largely from feminist perspective for their present day relevance to sociologies. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first part, it looks into 4 or 5 Ratna Naidu, Parvatamma, and Neera Desai. So it looks into the lives of early sociologists who are maybe not that known to the current generation, and pay more detailed attention to the living processes of pedagogy from the micro everyday practices, identifying intersecting potentials of sociologies and feminisms to bring freshness in the spirit of learning, and to attempt to examine how the substantive domains of science, health, environment, sexuality, and law either have been or could be transformed by feminisms, and sometimes vice versa, leading to a foundational change in both. So the third section is about how a feminist approach can be more productive when we look into substantive themes like say law, health, environment, sexuality, and science. So these are the three major parts of this particular book. Yeah, reading and writing early women sociologists, and this is of more importance to us, or particular importance to us, because it will be very interesting to see who are these important women professors, women scholars who was a part of the emergence of sociology and its consolidation, including people who participated in it in during 50s, 60s, 70s, and even before that. So much like today, women sociologists and anthropologists of the early generation too arrived at the women question either through their personal life experience of patriarchy in and outside the discipline, or through engagement with social movements. they rarely arrive it through the disciplinary necessity of sociology or anthropology. Okay, this is again a very important observation, because as a discipline, it never really challenged them through its inherent conceptual or theoretical arguments, because sociology, to a large part of its life, was oblivious to the richness of gender question, and rather it was seen as in the periphery. It is often the case with most sites of feminist epistemologies that seek to ask different questions in the discipline. Since sociology either explicitly or implicitly discouraged critical and theoretical engagement with these questions, or reproduce patriarchal explanations and solutions to these concerns, two things happened. One, as Kamala Ganesh argues, most of the women adopted the dominant disciplinary discourses, and two, when their unease with the discipline grew, they often took these questions outside of sociology, either into social activism. Okay, so there is elaboration about why and how many of these early women were also quite active in social movements and social activism, because and that needs a kind of sociological explanation itself. Had a historical fiction, Karve, Iravati Karve, or political commentary, Parvatama. Further, asking these concerns outside of sociology led to a gradual and definite separation from the discipline as the formation of separate centers of women's studies, which were interdisciplinary. So, Ganesh maps this life and work of a small group of women sociologists in the second generation of sociology in India to demonstrate these varied maps. Giving equal attention to the personal and professional persona of the sociologist, Ganesh attempts to read the three important principles of feminist praxis in their work: location, reflexivity, and intersectionality. Ganesh demonstrates how women sociologists of the early generation lived and worked within the contours of the discipline of sociology, particularly within the dominant debates of each decade, and chose to either push for the women question or remain silent on it. Okay, so it is important, because Kamala Ganesh is trying to make generalizations, certain observations about the lives of early, sociologists who had to work in a very, unfavorable situation regarding the kind of a gender question, because obviously the gender question, as it is seen as taken for granted today, or as it has occupied some more prominent position today, it did not occupy a prominent position back then. It was seen as periphery. So most of the sociologists, even though they were women, were either forced to be silent on that, or they were co-opted into the kind of a larger patriarchal paradigm, and then had to go ahead with that. And those who found this uncomfortable had to move out of the disciplinary boundary and then engage in social activism, or as they say, the establishment of women's study centers kind of further led to the kind of a ghettoization, rather than kind of making the discipline more receptive to these kind of emerging frameworks, either from whether it's from subaltern studies or women's studies or Dalit studies. So that is the important argument. Yeah, so there are instances about, for instance, despite the disciplinary emphasis on the axis of tradition, modernity, as well as modernization development on which theories of her times were built, Iravati Karve placed an emphasis on women within this. On the other hand, Parvatama, perhaps due to her location as a Dalit and the dominant theories of caste which came from above, chose to bracket out the gender questions. So it looks into that. It's a more substantive discussion about how these people, how this Meera Desai and Leela Dubey, had to negotiate with these kind of questions, and how we really look at them now. Now, another section is voluntarism and outside of sociology. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, many of these scholars had to resort to voluntarism or social activism outside the academia. Many times not as an extension of their academic activities, but as a result of a kind of a compulsion, because the disciplinary boundary of sociology was seen as more limiting and stifling, rather than the outside world, which offered more possibilities for kind of explanations and elaborations. Another thing that became evident, that the women who practiced sociology were also steeped in voluntarism. One can argue that this was because women's socialization to extend themselves to community work, and also because the nature of sociology to be concerned with social change. This interesting overlap of women's socialization and nature of sociology pushed women to move to the voluntary social work, though quite distant from philanthropy. In this context, Ganesh reads the work of Chandralekha Hattie. Apart from seeing Hattie's academic work as representing of the pre-1970s framework in which women is seen as a unitary category, Ganesh highlights the significance of the Kudumba Sakhi. Even in present-day Mumbai, the organization that Hattie set up, Kudumba Sakhi, has flourished as a unique venture assisting women to nurture livelihood options in Mumbai. So it talks about how many of these sociologists had a very strong engagement with the outside world, and they were part of movements, they were part of civil society organizations, they set up their own NGOs, or they set up the kind of a collective of women in doing that. Our readings push us in two directions. The move towards social work or activism can be read as outside of sociology and yet indicates to us the impulse of action, transformation, and deeply embedded praxis for which the objective canon of the discipline is unprepared, but which articulated the critical spirit and potential of the discipline. So, even though the discipline itself was incapable or unwilling to look into that, this outside world kind of really made use of the conceptual and theoretical potentials of the discipline. We submit that while assessing the contribution of sociologists, particularly women sociologists who did not have easy access to the inside sociology, these outer sociology interventions must be taken on board. So, the argument is that in order to evaluate the contributions of these early scholars, it is as important to look at their contributions outside sociology as that of what they have done for the discipline within sociology. So that's a kind of an argument, because that is also a sociology of these women and why that they had to behave or they had to contribute the way they contributed. Extending this idea of outer sociology, we would like to place on board the fact that women in sociology often find themselves using alternative modes of writing than purely academic one. A marked case in point is Airavati Karve's Yugantha. Airavati Karve was ahead of her time in many ways in her interdisciplinary approach to a subject. Yeah, so this particular literary work is quite famous, and it's important to see why that a scholar, sociology professor like Airavati Karve ventured into such kind of creative and literary works. Now, the question of intersectionality and standpoint. This again, the scholars are raising some interesting question. Now, intersectionality, an important contribution of feminist epistemology to the social science, is widely debated among feminist social scientists across the globe. It is something that women of color, is it something that women of color, women in post-colonial academia have always been practicing? Or is that something has been newly lent by the Western academic feminist? And this is something very, very interesting, because there is a time from say 1990s, 1980s and 90s by which the standpoint theory became more famous by Sarah Harding's and other works. But the editors are asking a very important question. Isn't it what many of these Indian sociologists, especially feminist sociologists, have been always talking about? Okay, though they may not have used this term or terminologies, isn't it exactly the same? Or should we say that it was handed over to us by the Western scholars, and then hence we started using it? Chowdhury argues that the politics of knowledge production at the international and global level, through the mechanisms of citations and appropriation, the work of women working from the third world is often marginalized. Much debated in the contemporary context, Ganesh takes this further back in the Indian context. The inclusion by early women sociologists of issues related to women using the idioms of colonial policy, reform and nationalist movements, as well as the latter village, community and region studies, must be read as attempts at early intersectionality in conjunction with those of caste, class, religion and region. So they argue that the very attempt to look into these positions as intersections of different categories, okay, women and caste, or women and rural life. So these things give you more sharper perspectives to understand the society. Discussing the work of another important women in sociology, C. Parvatama, Ganesh says that though mostly silent on issues of gender, her contribution to sociology demonstrates a a clear critical lens which questioned dominant viewpoints at that time. And there is an essay by Dr. Professor R. Indira on Parvatama in this volume, and it's very, very interesting, because it chronicles how Parvatama, who was born in a very poor Dalit family, had to struggle in her life, and how she was helped by other people, and how she went to the UK and then got a PhD, came back, and then how she became a very important scholar, widely respected and even feared by her fellow sociologists at that particular time. And it's also interesting to see how what kind of positions she had regarding, say, Dalit question or women's question. And it's interesting to see that she was very much against this whole idea of reservation. She herself did not avail it, and she was against that. She argued that it would kind of very negative impacts on society and other things. So how do we read a scholar like that? A scholar who was born in Dalit family, went abroad, came back, and who had to really fight the upper caste Brahminical and patriarchal elements within the within the academia, and yet took a very maybe in the contemporary period, at contemporary times, a kind of an unpopular position on reservation. Very, very interesting section of questions. And she was a very strong critic of Srinivas, saying that what Srinivas presented about Rampura village was indeed a kind of a Brahminical view. So yeah, as her characterization of M.N. Srinivas remembered village as a Brahminical view of Indian village as indicative of that. So these women, whether it is Iravati Karve or Parvatama or Neera Desai, they all represent interesting times, and it would be very fascinating to look at their work through the present concerns and debates. Ganesh argues that Parvatama built her career on a kind of professionalism of the time that opposed identity and difference-based epistemologies and practiced. Yeah, R. Indra, it talks about her life. So let's not go into that. But I would urge you to read that essay. It's a very interesting essay. Though Parvatama's work can be seen as an early approach to caste, one can ask, was it intersectional? Did it herald Dalit standpoint at all? If not, can we read one into that? Can we radicalize our readings of her further, depending upon our own locations? For instance, if we ask a Dalit sociologist today to reread Parvatama from a Dalit standpoint, we are sure that another reading is possible. So these works are amenable to multiple readings from the contemporary times. So that is one of the important things. Another scholar, Ratna Naidu, too struggled with the gaining success into academic profession. Kushal Dev's paper on Naidu documents that it was very difficult for her to get into the institutionalized academic positions in India, despite and perhaps because of her higher studies abroad. Okay, so it's also a reflection of a time when a woman comes back from higher studies, how she was seen differently by others. So these are more specifically about Ratna Naidu, and you can read that. Yeah. Speaking on her intellectual relevance today, it becomes clear that, as argued by Ganesh, Ratna Naidu too worked within the dominant and prevalent paradigm of her time. Yet Naidu's approach to the sociology of religion, one could argue, is an interdisciplinary one using psychoanalysis and psychology. The question to ask, the question asked by Uberoy, Deshpande and Sundar of Iravati Karve's contribution is, why does Ratna Naidu not figure in the canon of Indian sociology like do men sociologists of her time? Was it because of her interest in theory, which was considered as a male prerogative? Had she worked on women's issue, would she have been ghettoized or be more accepted? Very fundamental, uncomfortable questions as it is. Then the subsequent sections are about pedagogy and mentoring. It argues that pedagogy, as we see, as an important aspect of sociology and feminism. Both constituencies have dwelt extensively on the challenges of pedagogy, while a lot of this work comes from the macro pedagogic and knowledge-making concerns of institutional limitations of practice within higher education. It talks about how syllabi and other things are important role in that. Yeah, Maitreyi Chaudhary argues that the pedagogy and the intellectual legacy of sociology are part of one whole as we practice sociology in our classroom. She demonstrates how the classroom pushes us to devise new ways of looking at conceptual discourses. She argues the two tasks, pedagogic and conceptual, are intertwined and necessarily impinges upon each other. And there is again a quote by Avijit Pathak, professor of sociology at JNU, a very popular and very loved professor by almost every student of sociology. So he is also a very important scholar who speaks about the ethical moral dimensions about teaching and not to be carried away by the more recent troubling trends. So this kind of a critical sociological practice and pedagogy, the sociological consciousness that many of these founding fathers have spoken about, that how that helps in the integration of sociology of women with gender, with that of sociology of general sociology. Whether it may be the Marxist perspective emerging from the class or now the Dalit perspectives emerging from the caste, both offer critical apparatus for the classroom as a site of critical transformation and transgression of both the discipline and society at large. So, these scholars talk about how classroom atmosphere, classroom space, and new new perspectives emerging from Dalit or feminist or sexuality can be used as very effective pedagogical tools to question the existing and widely taken for granted knowledges, and to devise more interesting pedagogical practices and pedagogical frameworks. Yeah, so feminist pedagogies, Sharmila Rege's point, feminist pedagogies center on four common themes: an enduring connectedness to the living and the concrete, emphasize on participation and interaction, collaboration and cooperation, and teaching with a vision. Okay. Connectedness to the living and concrete is not narrowly interpreted as applied knowledge, but calls for a historical perspective on knowledge, which then invites students to personalize the domain of study through participation and sharing of life and experience. Very important idea, especially when you teach sociology, when you study sociology. It's always important to connect the disciplines with one's own life, one's own lived experience, and one's own biography. That is why a sociological perspective is something so important to look at from a personal perspective as well. Yeah, Rege argues to extend Du Bois' idea about passionate pedagogy, and Pujari in this volume extend the Hooke's idea of an engaged and transgressive pedagogy. So there are discussions on that. Then lived experience in the classroom. Speaking of classroom feminist pedagogies, we argue that knowledge making is participatory, non-hierarchical, and based on lived experience. Okay, very interesting yet highly debatable topic. We will discuss that later, whether lived experience provide you an additional vantage point for theorization or not. We will discuss that later. While the idea of lived experience as an analytic category of structures is not alien to sociology, the category of lived experience as a central epistemic character is unique to feminism. Okay, the debate among feminists is complex on this issue. Yeah, so we will take up that later when we take up Gopal Guru's and Sundar Saruke's debate. Then mentoring and care, another subtitle. Anurekha Chari Walk asks the question: is there something about sociology as a discipline that takes away from an engaged mentoring that feminists profess? Do women in sociology face the complex struggle between being women and being sociologists? On the other hand, some of us are asking the question: are we reproducing masculine cultures of academic practice even in women's study spaces? Despite feminist values of democracy and freedom, are we imparting only cultures of insecurities and anxieties? We would like to submit that, like all disciplines, women's studies also have fallen into the trap of legacy making. Chari Walk's paper, in a way, marks a rather poignant moment in the relation between sociology and women's studies in Pune University. So, it asks this kind of important question, whether feminist studies which claim certain values, certain moral positions, do they really adhere to that, or kind of do they also slip to other kind of values which are not that desirable. Then there are sections on substantive transformations, erasures, intersections, and insertions. The contours that emerge out of these encounters in subfields of sociology like science, health. Yeah, so these sections are kind of more, about more substantive themes, which I don't think is necessary that I go through them. There are specific arguments, specific sections about how the authors of this volume have looked into science, health, and environment, and similar kind of themes. So it's typical of any introductory volume of a edited volume, which try to summarize and then comment upon the volume, the contributions in this work. So so this section talks about Rennie Thomas' work on women scientists. So I'm not going to discuss that. And there is another, the last section is about gender, masculinity, and sexuality. Pushpesh Kumar's and Vishal J. Jadhav's engagement with the sexuality question has now again has complicated this whole gender narratives in more specifically. So that is a kind of a nutshell of this introduction. It's a lengthy introduction which provides a kind of larger orientation to the volume, and also it raises some of the interesting questions. And what I found most important or more challenging or more fascinating is the section on the early women sociologists. In that there's a chapter that summarizes all the women sociologists, but there are individual chapters dedicated to each of these women. So that really makes this volume very, very interesting, because many of these women are kind of forgotten, or they are no longer in the domains of mainstream sociology of contemporary India. Okay, so we are winding up this class today, and also this particular section on feminism and Indian sociology. We will move to the 10th week, that is about questions related to Dalit sociology and Indian sociology in the coming class. Okay, see you then. Thank you.